This is Still Enrolled.
And welcome on into this live edition of the Still Enrolled, a Big Ten football podcast. Thank you for joining us here as we get you set for spring football. I know a lot of spring games are going away, right? So they're trying to be marginalized, and maybe you think spring football is not that important. Oh, no. Oh, contraire. Spring football is still very, very important here. These 15 practices, I think, really kind of help shape your team's identity going into the next season. So I really think it's really important here over these next few weeks of how teams can build their foundation for what they look like in 2025. So most Big Ten schools, right, are about to start spring practice. Few have already gotten them underway. So I figured now is the perfect time to get into some spring football preview here. If you're just checking us out for the first time, appreciate you. Make sure you subscribe here on YouTube and also wherever you get your pods. Still Enrolled, so you can get a lot of Big Ten action coming your way. But I figured with the conference really getting set for spring football to start here, let's give you something to watch, something to look out for, whether it's your team or rivals team here as well, that they need to accomplish during these 15 spring practices over the next few weeks here. And so what we have is 18 questions, one question for each team that has to be answered by the time spring football is over. If you want to hear about your team, you want to give a concern or a thought about your squad, put it in the comment section here. We'll get to your questions and concerns throughout this live duration of the show. I promise you that. But let's get into it here. Let's dive right in and let's give the reigning champs the respect they deserve and start with Ohio State. Biggest question I think Ohio State needs to have answered by the time spring football is over is how much certainty do they have going into the summertime? You look at this roster, there is so many questions, so much turnover here that I think you need to have some things figured out as you get set for training camp to start in late July. Like you look at it, right? They have just 8 starters back on their roster from last year's national championship team. They have some gigantic questions, including at quarterback. You're going to have a quarterback battle between Julian Sayin and Lincoln Kienholz. I think it's going to be Sayin. Everything you hear about him, whether it's at Alabama or now at Ohio State, they rave about him and his ability to throw the football and the way he spins it. He should be the guy. But I think if you're Ohio State, you want to definitely, coming out of spring ball, know he's the guy. That's a question you need answered. By the way, more than just quarterback, you have 2 gigantic questions at coordinator where Matt Patricia comes in for the first time in decades to the college game, now is their D coordinator. Brian Hartline, who's been around for a while, but now has play calling responsibilities on his plate for the first time in his career. How does that look for the Buckeyes? There are a lot of big questions here that I think Ohio State has to have answered. You want to have some certainty, or as much certainty as you possibly can, going into training camp where you can kind of hit the ground running and build off of that. I mean, you look at their defensive line, like they are losing some legends of the program this offseason where their entire defensive line has to be replaced. Their offensive line is being rebuilt here as well. A lot of questions here. A lot of questions for the Buckeyes. And for me, the big question is how many questions can they answer? How much certainty can they have going to the summertime? They have a lot of talent, but a lot of it's unproven. Rare you have this many questions about a program like Ohio State. But I think for them, biggest question they need to have answered coming out of spring ball here, coming out of these 15 practices, is how much certainty can they have? How many questions can they have answered going into summer football? All right, next school here we're going to talk about is Wisconsin. A lot of questions. Very interesting offseason here for the Badgers as they go into 2025. A big year 3 for Luke Fickell. Biggest question I think they need answered is what does this new look Wisconsin offense look like? They hired Jeff Grimes now as their new OC. And you've heard Luke Fickell talk this offseason about how they kind of want to get back to the old school Wisconsin way, which is right, running the football, playing good defense, smash mouth physicality style that we are all used to seeing from Wisconsin for decades. But I think for the Badgers here to have success in this modern day college era, and now even in the Big Ten with Oregon, USC, Ohio State, Penn State, like all these teams, Michigan as well, coming in and or rising, they need to find a blend. they need to get back to their roots. I think that's a good idea by Fickle to kind of get back to say, okay, we tried the air raid, did not work, but let's go where our bread is buttered, which is running the football, leaning on our talented offensive line, and having a great lineage of running backs tote the rock for us for most of the game. They need to get back to that as like a foundational piece, but they also need to upgrade and modernize their passing offense. You can't just have a guy handing the ball off and have a quarterback basically be a game manager who can't throw the football. And I think Jeff Grimes coming in here, the goal at least is to bring that perfect balance in where they can get back to running the football efficiently, which is what they've done again historically for them, but also be able to throw the ball to win big games. Oregon, Ohio State, you need to be able to put points on the board. You can't win 19-13. You can't have your quarterback. You can't try to hide your quarterback, I should say, the way Wisconsin basically has for my lifetime of the last 30 years. Alex Hornibrook, we can go down the list of all these guys that have not been very good, that have just been there to hand the football off. So I think if you're Wisconsin here, the biggest question you need answered is, what does this Jeff Grimes offense look like? Because at least in theory, I think what they're trying to do is blend the perfect combo of historical success for Wisconsin, running the ball, with also easy for me to say, holy smokes, the modernization of the passing game, which you need your quarterback to make plays. He can't be a liability. And so that's really exciting to see. Jeff Grimes is a guy who does bring a physical style to the run game, which again works well for Wisconsin. And then the passing game is largely play action, which again, if you can have a quarterback make guys paying, that will do the Badgers well. Billy Edwards Jr. comes in, right? That's going to be obviously a big question for him coming from Maryland. Can he win the job? But I think even beyond that, forget who the quarterback is for a second here. Wisconsin needs to find an identity and a style of play that both works for them and also works in the modern era of college football. Once they have that figured out, everything else I think falls into place after that. That's the big question. What does their offense look like? How modernized is it? And can they find that perfect blend of where they try to go, all the way to, let's say, to the left side, right? To one extreme of Phil Longo with the air raid offense. They went from one extreme of the running the ball to all the way to the other with throwing the ball. If you can meet in the middle here, where you can get a good blend of the passing game while still relying on the run game, that is what benefits Wisconsin the most. What does their offense look like? That, to me, is the biggest question they need answered coming out of spring football here. Let's go to Illinois. I'm very excited about the Illini here in 2025. They have expectations, legitimate expectations to make the college football playoff. I think for me, in order for those goals to be met, the biggest question they need answered here in the spring is wide receiver development. With Brett Bielema, right, they're going to run the football. They're going to be a physical team. They're going to rely on their defense. But in order to take that next jump, right, in order to truly go from a 10-3 team with a great season last year to now be one of the 12 teams in the college football playoff, you need Luke Altmaier to improve even more than he did last year, and you need your receivers to play well. You look at Wisconsin, you look at Illinois, a big reason why that they have a college football playoff expectations, or at least expected to be in the mix this year, is because they have a lot of proven talent coming back. They got 16 to 22 starters coming back. But the position that was decimated this offseason more than any other, wide receiver. They lose their two top guys, Pat Bryant Jr., Zachary Franklin, both got to the NFL. So now if you're Illinois, you need to find a new batch of receivers that can come in and be as productive, if not more productive in this passing game for the Illini to take that next step from where they were, which was a really solid team, 5th in the Big Ten. First team out, if you will, to now one of those teams in the dance, one of those 12 playoff teams. Now, credit to Bielema. They did a good job so far this offseason in the portal. They got Hudson Clement out of West Virginia, who recorded 741 yards last year for the Mountaineers, had a big-time bowl game as well. That guy's proven production. It should be a plug-and-play, ideally, for him coming to Champaign. Justin Bowick as well, coming from Ball State. They've done a good job of getting some veteran presence on this roster. They also have some guys as well they need to step up. Hank Beatty, Colin Dixon. I think those guys on the roster already need to take another step for the Illini to get to where they want to go. And you look at the schedule here for Illinois. They're at IU early in the season. USC comes to town. Ohio State comes to town. If you want to win any of those games, you're going to have to score to win. And you're going to have to throw the football in order to win. So when you look at Illinois here and all the veteran presence they have coming back from a really solid year last year, the first year, honestly, in over 2 decades, which was the best one for them, in order for them to take the next step, in order for them to truly be a college football playoff contending team, they need at least question answered this spring. What do the wide receivers look like? How much do they develop? That to me is the biggest question Illinois needs to have answered here as they do go into their spring football practices. How about Minnesota, PJ Fleck, rolling the boat up there in Minneapolis? Biggest question they need answered, who's going to be QB1? Simple as that. We have a bunch of quarterback battles all throughout the Big Ten. We'll touch on most of them here. I think for Minnesota, biggest question for you is who can you rely on to be your QB? It's going to be a two-person race here. It's going to be Drake Lindsley, who was there in the program last year, sat behind Max Brosmer, and Zach Pyron comes in from Georgia Tech, who's played a few years, spot starts here, there, dual threat, does use his legs a lot, physical runner as well. I think this is a job that Lindsey should win. Again, I think having the experience of being in the program last year, there's plenty of articles and stories about how Max Brosmer really impacted Lindsey in his development as a four-star quarterback and what it takes to prepare to be able to win. So I think that was a great experience for Lindsey last year, sitting behind and watching Max Brosmer, a true pro, go about his work. I think that will impact him well. He's a big guy, big arm. He should come in here and I think win the job. And why it's important for Minnesota to get a quarterback that they believe in and that they have no doubt about is I do think Minnesota is going to need their quarterback this year more than ever. You have some turnover on the defense, and they've been a defense that has gotten a lot of turnovers and caused a lot of chaos in the last few years. But another DC leaves the program. PJ Fleck got to fill that again. I think you're going to look at this team looking at, relying on their offense first. I think it's going to be quarterback driven. So that's a huge question they need to have answered this spring. I don't think it's too early, by the way, to kind of call a quarterback competition. You want, right? Don't you want to see one of those guys separate themselves early on, kind of leave no doubt, set the tone going into summer ball and to training camp? That's why I think this question is the biggest one for them. Who is your quarterback? Who separates themselves? Drake Lindsley versus Zach Pyron. I think Lindsley will win the job. I think if you're a Minnesota fan, you want him to win the job. That question needs to be answered. If you have a good idea of who the quarterback is going to be after spring practice is over, I feel like you're going in the right direction here if you are Minnesota and PJ Fleck. All right. Let's go to Michigan, and let's actually have the same question they need to answer as Minnesota. Speaking of QB competition, the question for Michigan they need answered: can Bryce Underwood live up to the hype? This is the guy who was the number one player in all of the country. Just this last year, Michigan got him right down the road from Ann Arbor. They keep the best player in high school last year at home going to Ann Arbor. And we saw last year, right? Michigan needs a upgrade in the worst way on offense. When you look at passing attack last year, only Army, Navy, Air Force, the three service academies were worse in terms of passing offense than Michigan. So you're going to need an upgrade severely here when it comes to the passing attack. Bryce Underwood on paper brings that. Now the question is, can he show it? He showed it in college. He showed it in high school, showed it on 7-on-7s. Can he now bring that to Michigan right away and leave no doubt? He's going to be facing Mikey Keene, veteran quarterback coming over from Fresno State in the quarterback room. That's going to be the competition here, but I think you would forget the competition. If Bryce Underwood can live up to the hype that he is coming to Ann Arbor with, truly, sky's the limit for Michigan. Truly is how good of a talent he is. And what I also like here, and what's interesting is, speaking of Bryce Underwood, how does he fit in this new offense? They hire Chip Lindsey, who's kind of bounced around a bunch. But what Chip Lindsey brings, his style, his philosophy, I think will really help Underwood hit the ground running immediately. Lindsey was at North Carolina when Drake May was there. And I want to read you the stats. I think this is really kind of perfect to kind of show you how Underwood can flourish in this offense right away. So Drake May's last year was 2023. That UNC offense was one of two teams in college football to average at least 299 passing yards and 192 rushing yards per game. So that was a team that was extremely well balanced. They threw the football really well, but they also ran the football really well. They didn't put it all on Drake May's shoulders with a great talent that he is, and said, hey, Drake, go win us games. They still relied on the run game. They had balance. They kept defenses on their toes. That's what a Chip Lindsey offense looks like. Balance. So if you're Michigan here, especially if you're Bryce Underwood, you're coming into a program that was severely challenged last year passing the football, but now you have an offensive coordinator that is not just going to say, hey, Bryce, you're talented, you go win us games. No. He's going to give him help. He's going to say, we're going to run the football really well. We're going to make sure defenses can't predict what we're going to do, either running the ball or passing the ball. They're always going to be guessing, never know what's coming. That makes a quarterback's development that much easier, but also that much quicker. If Bryce is coming in and he can truly rely on the run game for Michigan, less is on his plate, which means he can pick it up faster, be more confident more quickly. That's huge. And so now when you finally get to see Bryce Underwood in the flesh here and had these 15 spring practices, the biggest question is, can Bryce Underwood live up to the hype? If the answer is yes, I don't think it's crazy to say Michigan in 2025 can be a playoff contender. I think to me, that's not crazy at all. They've done a good job in terms of roster retention. Sherrone Moore's done a great job in the not only in the portal, but also recruiting as well, high school recruiting so far since he's gotten there. I don't think it's crazy to call Michigan a playoff contender if the answer to the question of can Bryce Underwood live up to the hype is immediately yes. Big, big question there for Michigan going into 2025 that they need answered after these spring practices. Let's stay in the state of Michigan, just go just across town to East Lansing and Michigan State. Biggest question they need answered here this spring. Can they find offensive consistency? They have talent on this offense. The problem is it is wildly inconsistent. I mean, the final 10 games for Michigan State, they scored 19 or more points twice. Twice. That's it. And it's not like they're bereft of talent. I like Aiden Childs. He is a project. He's an experience. Like he's a young player, but I think he has talent. I think he has promise. And so can you mold this guy to get the most potential out of him while limiting mistakes? Jonathan Smith is a builder. He's a slow builder, but he has an idea of what wins. And I think right now going to year 2, if Michigan State can find some offensive consistency, they can absolutely be a bowl team. No doubt about it here, and get some momentum towards 2026 and beyond. I think it's already a great sign for the Spartans that they were able to retain their young receiver, Nick Marsh, who I'm sure had plenty, dozens of offers for big-time money to play almost anywhere else in the country. He stayed in East Lansing. He showed his belief in Jonathan Smith that he likes what's being built right now. But now going to year 2, they got to start capitalizing on that. They got to run the ball better. They were 110th in the country last year in terms of rushing yards per game. You can't put the offense, like we just talked about with Bryce Underwood, you need some balance, right? You can't put the entire offense on Aiden Childs' shoulders, kind of like they did last year. That's a recipe for disaster. Get some balance, find a rushing attack, try to limit the turnovers as well. That's something that killed the Spartans last year. They were tied for the 4th most turnovers in the Big Ten with 19. Cut down on the turnovers. Get some offensive consistency, because like on paper, I don't think it's crazy to say this is an offense that should score 25 points per game, 30 points per game. They have the talent to do so. The biggest thing is, can they find consistency? That to me is the biggest question Michigan State needs to have answered by the time spring ball is over here in a few weeks. This is my favorite one here. As we look at Iowa. Now, just as a heads up, the quarterback they got heralded out of South Dakota State and very much accomplished, Mark Gronowski. He is out for spring ball. Had shoulder surgery, so he's not going to be practicing, so we're not even going to talk about the quarterback here for spring football at least. So the biggest question I think Iowa needs answered here this spring is who will step up at linebacker. Is that not the most stereotypical question for any program here? Iowa, we're talking about defense. We're talking about linebackers. But it really is a big question for them here in 2025, because you look at what they lost this offseason. They lost their All-American linebacker, Jay Higgins. Outstanding player. Next to them, they lost a guy, Nick Jackson, who started 60 games in his career. Those guys are productive, veteran-laden, experienced. The problem for Iowa is behind them, not a lot of guys with experience. And so when you look at spring ball, who can separate themselves? I think this is going to be a big spring for Jaden Harrell, Carson Sherrar. Those guys are going to have the opportunity to take the job. I think if you're an Iowa fan, you're rooting for those guys to take the job and win it. And you look at how Iowa plays under Phil Parker defensively, the identity really is set with their linebackers. They get everyone set. They make plays. They're great stuff in the run. They're athletic in the pass game here as well. Iowa's success or failure has largely been determined on their defense. That's where their bread is buttered. That's where their identity is. And so while it is encouraging to see like at least the portal edition of Gronowski, his injury this spring, he to me is a non-factor when you look at spring football. They got to figure out their linebacker because from there you can figure out the rest of your defense. And as we know, even with the upgraded quarterback, this is still a team that's going to go as their defense goes. Biggest question for Iowa they need to have answered. Who is stepping up at linebacker in 2025 during this spring, during these spring practices? I love it. That is so Iowa. I love it. Let's go to Purdue. Biggest question Purdue needs answered spring ball, and they've already started it. What is the tone Barry Odom is going to set? He's coming to a rough spot here where Purdue is downtrodden. They're going from one defensive-minded coach in Ryan Walters to another in Odom. So you're not even getting that injection of energy that you would where if you go from a defensive guy to an offensive guy, you can maybe see some quick fixes and some more offensive explosive plays. Like you rarely see teams when they want to drastically change where they are, kind of keep the same end of the field as a head coach, in this case, defense. But bigger than that, Odom is now going to a program where they did lose their three best players last year, not to the draft, to the portal. Thiedemann going to Oregon, Will Heldt going to Clemson, and you lose Max Clare, the tight end, to Ohio State. Two of your three best players transfer in conference. That is a deflating move for a program that is trying to get any sort of grips right now in a brand new Big Ten and not trying to get left behind. And so that's what I'm interested to really see. What is the identity of the program? What culture can Barry Odom come in here and set right away? Because I think it's easy just to be like, Purdue, who cares? Write them off. This team's going nowhere. There's going to be a feeder school essentially for the bigger programs. And every year the Ohio States and the Oregons and the Penn States and the Michigans are just going to go raid their roster. Look at Iowa, a team we just talked about, right? That's a team that has an identity, that wins a certain way, that has found their niche in the Big Ten because they have built their team through development and attitude. I think Barry Odom could do the same thing here in West Lafayette. He's a defensive-minded guy. Identify unheralded players, identify diamonds in the rough, bring them, develop them, get those 2 stars to play like 4 stars, 3 stars to play like 5 stars. I think you could start to build a culture and an attitude where Purdue can gain respectability in the program again and not just be a bottom feeder in a stacked Big Ten. There is, I think, potential here, but what I want to see early on, and spring football is the best time for this, exactly what we're talking about here, setting the culture and setting the tone. What does a Barry Odom coached Purdue team look like? What's the attitude look like? What's the philosophy going to be? What's the energy? This is the time it sets. And that's when it's all said and done here and Purdue is done, I'm excited to see what this team, how they sound, what they look like, where the optimism is going into training camp and going to the summertime. What kind of tone can Barry Odom set? That to me is a big question I want to see answered here by the time spring football is said and done. Let's go to Indiana, where just like they did last year when Kirkston came in, they brought in a lot of transfer players. A lot of guys left, a lot of guys coming in. Biggest question, though, I think they need answered here by the time spring football is over is their offensive line developed enough to take the next step in 2025? You go back to last year, the great season they had. 2 games they lost, Ohio State, Notre Dame. Biggest reason they lost, the offensive line stunk. They got worked. Curtis Rourke back there was running for his life. He got sacked 8 times in those 2 combined games, and that feels like an undersell because you watch any of those 2 games, all it is he taking the snap and running around. You should have probably got sacked 15 times. So that offensive line was the biggest Achilles heel for Indiana in the 2 biggest games they played last year, the 2 games they lost against the 2 best teams they played in Ohio State and Notre Dame. Can they build off of that? Can they improve that O-line in order for them to take the next step here under Cignetti? Now, they lose their all Big Ten center in Mike Kadick. Big loss for them. But I love the additions Cignetti made in the portal, where they went in and got offensive lineman Pat Coogan from Notre Dame, Khalil Benson from Colorado, Zen Mikowski from Ohio State. They've gotten guys who have played, who have proven it before. They have a lot of experience. Now it's in these 15 practices going to the summer, Can they gel? Can they form a bond? Can they start to build a foundation of this offensive line is going to be meaner, tougher, better than it was last year? You know, there's going to be a lot of attention around Fernando Mendoza coming in from Cal as a new quarterback, replacing Curtis Rourke. But just kind of, again, like we saw in the biggest games, he means nothing if that offensive line can't block, can't establish a run game whatsoever. The next step for Indiana here to be a repeat playoff team is getting that offensive line to play like one of the best in the Big Ten. That's a question, and that identity can be built right now in spring football. That's the question I want answered here for Indiana. What does that offensive line look like? Can they get better? Can they get tougher here in these 15 spring practices? That's the question I think they need answered more than any other one this spring out in Bloomington. All right. We're just about halfway through. Appreciate you tuning in. If you're just tuning in, whether it's now, if you're listening to us on the podcast feed, appreciate you. If you're watching this on YouTube later on, thank you for joining us. We've got 9 storylines down, or 9 questions, I should say, down, 9 to go. If you have any questions so far, you can write in our live chat right now on YouTube. You can also tweet me, Ryan_Hickey3. And if you're wondering, because I just realized I forgot to bring it up during the open, Brian Tripp on vacation this week, resting those pipes as Penn State hockey is a big Big Ten semifinal game coming up this weekend against Ohio State. So Tripp is off this week. We'll be back next week for sure. All right. Let's go and start the second half here of the biggest question each Big Ten team needs to have answered here by the time spring ball finishes. Let's go to Northwestern. Very similar, actually, to what we just talked about with Indiana. It's offensive line development, offensive line improvement. The Wildcats have questions at quarterback. They have questions at receiver. But guess what? To me, those questions right now are irrelevant because if you don't have 5 guys blocking, it doesn't matter how good your quarterback is. He's not going to have success. You can't block. You can't protect. The entire offense goes to crap. So I was going to say a different word, but it's family friendly show here, so we'll keep it clean. And what I do like for Northwestern is they attacked their offensive line this offseason in the portal, and they value the most experience. They're able to land Minnesota guard Martez Lewis. He's one of the top guards in the portal when he entered. Coming on over from Minnesota, he's now on the roster. And what they did, you ready for this? They've added 3 transfers with 17 seasons of combined experience. Think about that. 3 players that have been around for either 5 or 6 years. They have combined for 17 seasons of playing football. So the experience is there. That should lead them to gelling faster. Right? A bunch of new names and offensive line is definitely, I think, the hardest to form a bond with. But when you have so many experienced players, I think kind of bring them together, should be able to hit the ground running, should be able to form some chemistry faster. So for David Braun, again, I think the biggest question for you is, can you get that offensive line to play better in 2025 than it did in 2024? Because, again, nothing else matters on offense. Quarterback, running back, receiver do not matter if those 5 guys up front can't block. Biggest question for Northwestern here is their offensive line improvement. Biggest question I think Nebraska needs to have answered by the time spring ball is over is, can those new wide receivers develop chemistry with Dylan Raiola? Last year, I think one of the biggest reasons why Nebraska, and they made a bowl game, which is a success, but they could have had an even better season, is those receivers to me did not step up consistently enough to help out their true freshman quarterback. And so I love Matt Rule going into the portal right away and bringing in experienced, proven players. He goes to the SEC, gets Dane Key out of Kentucky, who had 715 yards last year. Goes out west, gets Isaiah Hunter from Cal, 578 yards last year. Proven, productive talent at some big-time schools already, now coming to Lincoln, Nebraska. I love that. Because, again, I think last year, one of the weaknesses for Nebraska was their wide receiver play. And now you get Ja'Cory Barney, who's also a freshman last year as well. Another year in the system, another year under his belt here. You have some proven players, so some pressures offense to make it play a little bit freer and be more productive. Nebraska needs more consistency from their wide receivers to take that next step here in 2025 and to maybe be in the mix for a big bowl game / dare I say, college football playoff. And that was a discussion last year when we looked at Nebraska's schedule early on. I definitely drank the Kool-Aid, was burned by it. But now, year number 2 here, we're going to get back on the horse. Not yet, but that if that question is answered here, if the receivers can show quick chemistry with Raiola and get on the same page early on here, so where there's some good feelings going to the summertime, that might change as we get closer to the season. But that's the biggest one here. And also, kind of to add to that, right? Remember, Dana Holgorsen, their offensive coordinator, was hired in a bizarre move in like November. So he came in, was calling the plays like a week after getting hired. Now he's a full offseason to get some of his guys that he thinks can be productive in the system into Nebraska. He had a full offseason to work with Raiola. So now in these spring practices, you can kind of see truly what the Holgorsen offense will look like for the Big Red and see how those receivers can fit right in there. So that to me is the biggest question Nebraska needs to have answered. Can those receivers develop chemistry with Dylan Raiola? That is going to be the key for them to take that next step here in 2025. Let's go to UCLA. Let's go all the way out west. Biggest question UCLA needs answered here and during spring ball. What the hell is the identity of the team going to be? Forget the transfer portal for a second here. UCLA is a program under Sean Foster. They've had massive staff changes this offseason. Eric Bieniemy, their OC, out. Tino Sinceri coming over from Indiana. He's in. New offensive line coach, new running back coach, new safeties coach, new special teams consultant here as well. What does this team look like? Because the identity of the team, I get it starts with head coach and Deshaun Foster is there, so he doesn't leave. But the identity of the team is really built starting with the coaching staff, the whole entire staff. You're bringing a lot of guys. What does that look like for UCLA? You know, they've had a lot of player movement as well, but where it starts is the coaching staff. What is the identity of the team? That's where I think if you are UCLA, that's the biggest goal of these 15 spring practices. What is your program going to look like? What is the identity of this team going into 2025? All right, let's just go across town here to USC. Biggest question that I think they need to have answered here during spring practice. How tough are they in the trenches? Because in order for USC to take this next step here, in order to be a true Big Ten contender and a national championship contender, they need to be better on the offensive line and the defense line. Like, look at the glory days for USC under Pete Carroll. Sure, they had Matt Leinart and Reggie Bush and amazing receivers. But that team was successful first and foremost because they had a great offensive line and a great defensive line. Lincoln Riley needs to get back to that. To their credit, whether it's the transfer portal, but especially in recruiting, they've done a good job attacking that. And so when you look at this defensive line for USC going into spring football, they got guys like Keyshawn Silver from Kentucky. They got guys like Jamal Jarrett from Georgia. They were able to recruit and land 5-star stud Jakeem Stewart from Louisiana. So you go to the SEC, you get 2 defensive linemen, you get a third recruit out of Louisiana, you go down to the Deep South, you win that recruiting battle. They've gotten some transfers out of the transfer portal to fill in that offensive line. They are making a conscious effort, I think for the first time at USC, to truly get tougher in the trenches. That's where games will be won or lost for USC. They had a lot of moves. Can they work out? That's the big question here. Can we come out of spring football talking about USC truly being different and better on the offensive line and the defensive line? If the answer is yes, there's a reason to buy into USC going forward here. If the answer is no, I think we're looking at a lot of what happened last year, repeat of 2024, where you're barely able to make a bowl game and losing a few games you shouldn't. Can USC get tougher in the trenches? You can find that out right now. You can find that out during spring football. That is the biggest question USC needs to have answered here in these 15 spring practices. Let's go north. North of USC all the way to Eugene, Oregon. Biggest question I think Oregon needs to have answered here in spring football is this. Can they convert the massive talent they have on their roster into production? Oregon is one of the most talented teams in the country. The thing, though, is they don't have a lot of production either on the roster in general in their careers or a lot of production at Oregon. You know, they've done a great job recruiting. They've done a great job in the transfer portal. You look at guys on the roster like Dante Moore. You have freshman receiver Corian Moore. It's going to be stud. That's a highly proven guy coming in as a true freshman. Malik Benson, receiver, comes over from Florida State. Your bookend tackles are going to be Isaiah World from Nevada and Alex Harkey from Texas State. Bear Alexander is a guy who comes in who's been around the world a little bit. Georgia, USC, now Oregon, super insane talent. Not been able to put together a lot. Naeem Offord, big time get for Oregon, top 20 player in the country. They were able to get. He comes in as a true freshman. And those are just some of the names that Oregon has on their roster. There is so much talent right there in just some of the names we listed. But the thing they all have in common is they have a lot of production, a lot of hype. They have yet to prove it at Oregon. I don't have really a doubt of Dan Lanning's ability to develop this talent and get the most out of them. But it is a question. They did lose a lot of proven talent from the roster last year and even the year before that. How do they replenish that talent? How do they replenish, I should say, that production? They have a lot of talent. Now it's time to convert that talent that they have on the roster and on paper into production on the field. You could start to see guys separate right away here during spring football. That's the biggest thing I'm watching here for Oregon. Can they get all that talent they have on paper to now start producing on the field come spring? If we feel like that answer is yes, boy, Oregon might be the favorite here to win the national title. They are that good, that deep. Now it's just all about producing. Let's go to their rival here in Washington. Biggest question the Huskies need answered this spring. Can their offensive line give this team a chance? This was the worst O-line in the Big Ten last year. They allowed the most sacks in 2024. And so to their credit, they've gone out and made changes. They haven't sat on their hands. They got Carver Willis from Kansas State. They went and got an old friend back in Gary and Hatchett, who was there, went to Oklahoma. Now he's back. All right, Damon Williams is going to get a lot of attention for the Huskies, and rightfully so during spring and during the summer, because he's now, although he started a few games last year, right, this is his first year as the true full-time starter for Washington. He's going to get a lot of attention. But kind of what we talked about before with Northwestern amongst other teams, it doesn't matter who your quarterback is and how talented he is if he doesn't have time to throw the football because the guys in front of him can't block. And so that's what I'm watching here. Can Jedd Fisch develop his offensive line, find the right guys to plug in to give this team a chance? If so, then we can really see the talent of Damon Williams on full display in 2025. If not, I mean, thank God he's fast and athletic because he's going to be running for his life. So if you're Washington, that's the question you need answered here. Can your offensive line start to gel? Can you set a tone here and get some momentum going to the summertime? Because if so, again, you have to feel pretty bullish about the Huskies in 2025. If not, it feels like they are going to be a disappointment here in terms of what they should be able to accomplish versus what they actually do accomplish, because their offensive line does not give the offense a chance to fully run to its capabilities. Let's go to Penn State. Big offseason for Penn State. They retain a lot of their big-time players. They land Jim Knowles. It's been a huge offseason for the Nittany Lions. Biggest question they need to have answered coming out of spring ball: can they find a true, legitimate, reliable receiver? That's been the biggest thing holding Penn State back here the last few years. They have not had a receiver or receivers that are game breakers, that are reliable, that are consistent. And you look at now the losses Penn State has. They lose Omari Evans and Trey Wallace. Their two leading receivers. They transfer elsewhere. So you look right now at the current roster in terms of returning production. The leading receiver for Penn State last year is Liam Clifford, who totaled 18 catches for just 286 yards and 1 touchdown. In order for Penn State to win the national title this year, they need more production out of their receivers. You can, I think, directly point to that being the biggest reason why they lost to Notre Dame in the College World Playoff National Semifinal. And so Franklin he went out and got Devontae Ross out of Troy. He had over 1,000 yards, 11 touchdowns last year. And he went and got Kyron Hudson, an athletic receiver from USC. Franklin's gotten receivers in the past in the portal, and for the most part, a lot of them have been disappointments. A lot of them have flamed out and have not lived up to the hype. So I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, Penn State did a great job in the portal. They got to prove it. And I think you can see right away now in these spring practices who separates themselves. Who does Drew Aller like throwing the football to? Who is impressing right away? Who is coming in, hit the ground running, and starting to leave no doubt of, hey, this guy could be a dude. This guy could be a guy for us that is a reliable receiver, a go-to guy. Penn State's not had a go-to guy since Jahan Dotson in 2021. For Penn State to win a national title this year, it's going to be on the wide receiver room, how much they develop. And that's what I'm watching right away here. I think that answer that question can start to be answered immediately right now in the spring. Can Penn State's wide receivers step up enough to be reliable here and give Drew Aller confidence in 2025. All right, two more here. Two more questions to go for 18 Big Ten spring football questions. Let's go to Rutgers here. We'll finish with the two newbies, Rutgers and Maryland. Let's go to Rutgers. Biggest question they need answered here. Can the work they did in the portal on the defensive line cash out, if you will? Can it work? Because at least on paper, production, Rutgers, Greg Schiano did a really good job in the portal of getting, we'll say, flyers on a few guys that could be low risk, high reward, right? They're able to get Eric O'Neal out of James Madison, who last year recorded 13 sacks and was first team All Sun Belt. They also got Bradley Weaver out of Ohio, second team All MAC, He had 8.5 sacks, 3 forced fumbles. There's a lot of production right there in those two guys that be able to produce at a smaller level at their respective school. If they can come into Rutgers and repeat the performances they had in 2024 here in 2025, that defense for Rutgers is going to be tough, man. They're going to give a lot of teams fits. Right? Like when you look at a Greg Schiano team and how he wants to build his team, the identity for them to have success, it starts defensively. He's a defensive-minded guy. He wants to win in the trenches. He wants to shut your offense down. If you can get these two players in O'Neal and Weaver to come in and wreak havoc the way they did at their old schools, and we're talking about sacks, we're talking about forced fumbles here, we're talking about 3 and outs, Rutgers is going to be a tough team, at least defensively, to try to play here. That is where I think the success for Rutgers in 2025 happens. It starts on the defensive side of the football. It starts with those two guys on the defensive line hitting, coming in, having the production they had previously. So that to me is the biggest question here. Can they develop that offensive line? That defensive line. We've said offensive line a ton here. My apologies. Can they develop that defensive line to be as disruptive as it looks on paper? And finally here, the last question that a Big Ten school needs to have answered, it goes to Maryland, and it's simply, can you develop Justin Martin? He's a quarterback you got coming over from UCLA. He played a little bit, as mostly Garbers played for UCLA, but in the limited time he had, I actually liked what I saw from Justin Martin. That guy showed some promise, and he played at Penn State in a loss, but I thought he held his own. I thought he kind of looked in control for a guy that has not played a lot of football at the college level. He was composed, made some good decisions. He's a mobile player, so he's a dual threat. Like, that's a guy where if you go look at Maryland and their identity, right? Under Mike Locksley, they're going to be an offensive-driven team. They want the quarterback to throw the ball up. They want to be putting up 35, 40 points. They want to outscore you. They're not going to rely on their defense to win games. They want to outscore you. And they're not going to really run the football out. They want to throw the football. They're kind of like the Dolphins, if you will, of college football, of the Big Ten, where they're more finesse and they are more pass first, ask a lot of their quarterback. So there's going to be a lot put on Justin Martin's plate, I think, this year, both from a passing perspective and a running perspective. He's got the physical tools to succeed. The question is now, with, going to a new offense and getting some more experience, can he hit? If he hits, I think Maryland can be like Rutgers here, a spunky team. We saw them last year beat USC in an upset that nobody saw coming. I think they could be in a position, if Martin hits here, to maybe get a big win on their schedule, to at least push teams and make that game more of a concern than, let's say, it has been in the past few years. Justin Martin, if you can start to see some promise here, start to see some development in these 15 spring practices and kind of feel like, okay, we got something here, a quarterback going to training camp, I think, to me, that's a big win for Maryland. That's a huge, huge win if that question can be answered, or at least that question you could start to feel some confidence. I'm not saying it's to fully answer it and leave no doubt that this is the guy and he's going to come in here and play really well. Again, he's inexperienced, still got a long way to go learning curve-wise, and in a new program, not going to hit the ground running just like that. But if you can at least see some momentum and start to feel like, okay, we got something here, I think if you're Maryland here, that's all you can ask for during these spring practices. So that's going to do it. We just broke down 18 questions. The biggest question each Big Ten team needs answered coming out of spring football. If you are listening to this, again, not live, and you still want to give your thoughts, whether it's a reaction to my biggest question I'm watching, whether it's to something add on or piggyback, please tweet me, Ryan_Hickey3. That's Ryan_Hickey3, or just comment on the video on YouTube. even though we're live right now, it will still be living there. So go check us out if you haven't already on YouTube. Still enrolled on YouTube. This also will be posted on our podcast feed, which you can find our podcast feed anywhere you do get your pods. Still enrolled is the title. So you can tweet me, Ryan_Hickey3, your thoughts. And also you can write in the comment section of the live video as well, your thoughts on your team's biggest question, the question you want to see answered here coming out of spring football. Again, I know a lot of spring games are getting canceled, they're getting marginalized, but spring football is still very important. Very, very important here to building the foundation for 2025. And so I think if every team we just went through can answer the question we just talked about, there is reason for hope and optimism here going into 2025. That's something you should keep your eye on and be alert to. So with that, enjoy the rest of your week. We will be back, and Brian and I will be back this time next week to break down some more Big Ten action and kind of give you some updates here on spring football as well, and kind of seeing what we're hearing, what we're watching as well. So have a great week. We'll talk to you next week right here on the Still Enrolled podcast.